Today I'm going to respond to what I would ordinarily consider to be an outrageous and offensive set of comments about the Bhagavad Gita. But they are so comically misinformed and out of context that all you can do is laugh, really. Even so, I will take the time to break down why Slavoj Žižek, who is otherwise famed for his sharp intellect, has utterly missed the point of Krishna's teachings. I will note, however, before I begin, how frequent this type of nonsense is. Leading Western intellectuals come and spew nonsensical vitriol against Hinduism, the Bhagavad Gita, and the like, without any balanced response or general condemnation for misrepresenting one of the world's biggest religions and most read books. Now, I don't mean to advocate for blasphemy laws, cultural sensitivity, or the like. That doesn't bother me in the slightest. I mean basic intellectual honesty and discipline. So, let's get to it.
I like the political aspect. What I didn't like is this pseudo-Oriental Hindu depth of, Bhagavad Gita, all that stuff. And let me briefly explain to you why. This got me a couple of months ago in deep trouble in India. The first sexual act, Florence Hugh making love with Oppenheimer.
Yes.
And she asked him or she her to quote, read Bhagavad Gita. Okay, Indians exploded. They said, sorry, this is our sacred book. How can you spoil it, reading, putting it into such a dirty context of illegitimate sex? You know what was my reply? I agree with you, but in the opposite sense. You have a beautiful, loving sexual act, and you spoil it by quoting one of the dirtiest books of all the time.
So let's first address the movie scene. I don't like blasphemy laws, and I don't care much for cultural sensitivity for its own sake. If something ought to be criticized and addressed for a good reason, then it should be, and we can deal with hurt feelings later. That's my clear stance. However, the capricious and unnecessary decision to inject the Bhagavad Gita into a sex scene was distasteful. Since it wasn't meant as a criticism of the Gita or its principles, it ends up just being an unnecessary provocation. Is it a justified cause for outrage by the Indians? No, not in my view, but it warranted a conversation with the director to point out the unfortunate use of the Gita because it could have been better, and that's a fact. Now, Žižek's dismissal of the Bhagavad Gita as one of the dirtiest books of all time displays a total lack of understanding and ironically exposes him as a pseudo-intellectual commentator that should work on his Purva Paksha considerably before re-engaging with the Gita. So let's explore why exactly he made that statement, because Purva Paksha means to understand the other position before you critique it, and it was sorely lacking. So if we break down what he said, what exactly is at the core of his criticism, we'll find exactly where Slavoj Žižek needs to work on to improve his understanding and come back to the topic in a more informed manner.
Believe me, let me tell you a fact. Do you know that Bhagavad Gita was a favored book of Heinrich Himmler, the author of Holocaust, chief of SS? You know why? Yeah, he thought in an ironic sense, ethically. His problem was this. SS officers and soldiers had to do horrible things, killing Jewish women, children, and so on. How can they do this without becoming bestial, brutal themselves? And his reply was, Bhagavad Gita, don't identify with your acts, act at a distance from yourself. So no wonder that some kind of this pseudo-Oriental thought is extremely popular among parts of the new elite. Like, you are doing horrible things, but you say, no, I'm just acting this is not the real me, and so on and so on. You see, but that's my problem with Oppenheimer. Less of that Oriental stuff of mysteries and so on, and more about political background and so on.
The fact that Heinrich Himmler found personal justification for his actions in the Bhagavad Gita does not reflect the text's true teachings. It cannot be used as a legitimate stick with which to beat the Gita. Himmler's selective reading of the Bhagavad Gita for ideological purposes demonstrates a misuse rather than a legitimate philosophical engagement. Philosophical texts especially, and Žižek should know this, should be understood in their entirety, considering their ethical and spiritual teachings, rather than cherry-picking parts to justify immoral actions. So having said that, let me introduce the context and the wider philosophical corpus that invalidates Himmler's and Žižek's interpretations of the Gita. When analyzing a text, it is vital to establish the author's tatparya, which means its intended meaning or message, so as to not mischaracterize the book. The Paramahamsa philosophical school offers a technique known as tatparya shadlinga, a system of 6 indicators that are used in order to determine the intention of the text. These are, first, upakrama upasamhara, which means the introduction and the conclusion, abhyasa, which means repetition, apurvata, which means novelty, phala, which means results, arthavada, which means praise, and upapatti, which means logical reasoning. Now, as I am filming this as a direct response to Žižek's claims, I'm not going to break down all of these 6 indicators because their findings are not all relevant to the topic that he particularly addressed. In actual fact, the tatparya of the Gita is to demonstrate the supremacy of bhakti yoga towards God as a means for liberation, as the fulfillment of life. This is obviously completely unrelated to Žižek's criticism, so as previously stated, I'm only going to consider the first indicator this time, upakrama upasamhara, the introduction and the conclusion. So what is the introduction of the Gita? In chapter 2, verse 7, Arjuna says, "With my heart overcome by weakness and my mind confused about my duty, I urge you to tell me clearly what is good for me. I am your disciple and I take refuge in you. Please teach me." But by the end of the Gita, in chapter 18, Arjuna responds saying in verse 73, "My delusion has been destroyed. By your grace, O Krishna, I have regained my understanding. I am freed from doubts. I stand strong and will act according to your word." Confusion and weakness as to how to conduct oneself end in clarity and strength. So what are Krishna's words that Arjuna is now committed to act in accordance with? Sakta karmani avidvamso yata kurvanti bharata kuryad vidvamsh tata shaktas chikrishu loka sangraham. In chapter 3, verse 25, Krishna says, Arjuna, just as the ignorant act with attachment to their work, so should the wise act without any attachment, thinking only for the welfare of the world. Now, does this verse even remotely condone the idea that as long as one feels guilt-free in detachment and non-identification, then you may murder as many people as you like? No chance. Detachment and non-identification do not imply a lack of moral responsibility. Instead, they encourage individuals to act purely and selflessly without selfish, ego-driven desires corrupting their actions. This is in essence the marriage between karma yoga, which means selfless, detached action, and dharma, righteous conduct. Now I've introduced dharma. So what is dharma? The Mahabharata, which by the way is the wider text to which the Bhagavad Gita belongs to, defines it as such. Adroha sarvabhuteshu karmana manasagira anugrahascha danamcha stam dharma sanatanaha. The eternal duty, the sanatana dharma, towards all creatures is the absence of malevolence towards them in thought, deed, or word, and to practice compassion and charity towards them. Now, if that is indeed true, why then does Krishna seemingly encourage Arjuna to engage in a war and to kill his aggressors? A fair question. Because we must protect that which is worthy of protection, or see it die. If we value life, we must value dharma. Dharma is that which sustains life, which promotes non-violence and compassion to all. Now, if that very system comes under attack by those who have no desire to uphold it, then our inaction is nothing but complicity in its destruction. Krishna says, Arjuna, whenever there is a decline in dharma and an increase of adharma, unrighteousness, it is then that I manifest myself for the protection of the good, for the destruction of the wicked. And to establish dharma, I incarnate myself from age to age. Now those are Krishna's own words, stating his own intention for acting as he does. In light of our previous definition of dharma from the same body of text, how then could Žižek possibly conclude that Himmler's use of the Gita was legitimate? Was Himmler acting only for the welfare of the world? Was he defending the absence of malevolence towards all creatures, practicing compassion and charity towards them? Was he fighting for the protection of the good and the destruction of the wicked as per the guiding compass of Dharma? Now, I don't believe I need to answer those questions. So stop with your pseudo-intellectualism, Slavoj Žižek, insofar as it pertains to Bhagavad Gita and Sanatana Dharma at large. Humble yourself. Dedicate the time it takes to truly understand what you're talking about before going on national television and frankly embarrassing yourself. But it is an error easily corrected. So if you ever want to revise your opinion and have a serious discussion, a conversation about the Gita or Vedanta, it will be my pleasure. Jai Gurudev.